Welcome to 21st SGS Podcast, where we dive deep into crossroads of sustainability and digital transformation, revealing how AI and emerging tech can drive real impact into fighting against climate change. It is the time for bold action, fresh perspectives, and future-ready mindsets. That's a key word, mindset. Let's explore how sustain, grow, and lead sustainable change together in an era where science denial, therefore, inaction to fight climate emergency is becoming fashionable. We need to act with urgency to secure the planet for humanity and businesses to coexist, thrive in the 21st century. So, Dr. Ravi, thank you very much for coming for the second episode of digital transformation and sustainability in the topic under the 21st century leadership and code red. Last episode, we touched base. What is the climate emergencies? Do we have a climate emergency? And how are the world leaders responding to it, especially the international bodies like UN? And at the same time, what kind of amount of capital that we need to deploy to make a better world? With that note, our second episode will kick off with the subject of 21st century leadership. Is it science-led? And what do you consider to be the main obstacle and blocker holding back the urgent response to climate emergency? Dr. Ravi, we are very, very excited to hear your thoughts and your knowledge on this subject.
Thank you very much, Dishana. In terms of the question, what do you consider to be the main obstacles, blockers holding back the urgent response to the climate emergency? One of the factors that we must bear in mind is both national leaders and business leaders have come into those leadership positions, and the kind of subjects that they were exposed to when they were doing their studies, unfortunately, have not captured the sense of and prepared them for facing the climate emergency. And I would say one of the main obstacles to business leaders and national leaders addressing the climate emergency and understanding the climate emergency is, unfortunately, they've not been brought up to speed with this. And this is one of the major factors that are holding back action. So think for a moment about a business. Business leaders today, CEOs and C-suite leaders, would generally come into these kind of positions having done MBA. And if I look at the MBA curriculums in the past 10 years, the subject of sustainability, the subject of climate emergency have never been even articulated or brought into their domain. So, in terms of 21st century leadership, I think this is one of the first key literature documents which insist that the 21st century leaders have to be science-led. So, let me just answer the question, why? Just imagine a business leader whose focus is delivering profit and in improving the shareholder value. Where does the term science come into this? The word science doesn't come into this, and they would be focused on achieving this in terms of the numbers, in terms of delivery of product and services. But if you aren't science-led, you are not going to even accept the fact that there is a climate emergency around the corner. And I believe that in the future MBA programs of the world, the Masters of Business Administration, having a course on Science 101 will become an essential ingredient for all business leaders in the future, because we cannot create another generation of business leaders who come into C-suite boards and business leadership who are not fully conversant with the importance of having a science-led attitude to the business and to address the climate emergency. Why would a business leader even consider addressing what you and I call the climate emergency if they aren't convinced in the first place that there is a massive problem with the climate emergency where global warming is accelerating? And not only is global warming accelerating, we are beginning to now see the planet getting pummeled with extreme weather incidents that are destroying global economies and global supply chains. So that is simply looking at business leaders. Even when you look at national leaders, the amount of national leaders who have come into national leadership with a science-led background is extremely limited. So I think it is in everybody's interest to make sure that when a person ascends to a national leadership position or when someone ascends to a business leadership position, that they are totally up to speed with the scientific evidence and understanding the science on the climate emergency as a step one. If we don't prioritize science and if leaders do not prioritize planet and people before they look at profit or before they look at government initiatives, then the danger is exactly what we are facing today. I mean, after 36 years of knowing the subject, we find that the aptitude and the energy and the commitment to lead in terms of fighting the climate emergency is not there. And this is something that we need to take a course correction on, Ishana.
Thank you for that explanation, Doctor. I believe everything has a scientific explanation, and you need to look at things in that angle rather than you. Science is always with facts based and evidence based. So it's not just decisions are being made randomly, and understanding what's really happening, seeing that at a microscopic level of its changes, and you taking actions. I strongly believe in what you're saying, Doctor. And that also leads into some risk factors, why it is such an important behavior. Recent McKinsey has exposed that 63% of companies around the world, if they don't meet the carbon reduction targets by 2030, 63% of those companies at a higher risk. And now this is something which people have never come to compute. Always companies look at upside risk in the sense, if your company grow beyond your expectations, whether you have the capacity to fulfill those needs. And the other one is the downside risk in terms of the unseen activities can take your business down, can be new competitors coming in, new technologies, etc. But a lot of people put very little risk elements in terms of climate change because they believe the climate is going to remain as it is. But now everybody's understanding that that's one of the highest risk factors to be plug into your annual and long-term planning. And that has to be looked at it very seriously. So I think you really add value to that conversation. And I'm also wants to ask another, a little bit away from the topic that we just addressed, but I'll get back to the subject once again, a little bit of a deviation. I remember seeing and reading this, and also you have nicely articulated this in your book, 21st Century Leadership, that the planetary boundaries, and it's quite an interesting, I learned about it from that book in terms of planetary boundaries. So we have 9 planetary boundaries and we have already crossed 5. and we are in the we are very soon going to hit 6 and 7. So that's quite alarming. And if we cross all 9, then we are going to have devastating events around the world. Everything is going to go up in 10, 15 folders in terms of heat waves to sudden weather conditions, floods, rising of a sea level, and etc. And these things can happen in a rapid of like a very short period of time. Would you be able to just spare about extra 5 minutes to just elaborate that part of it for audience to understand what it really means?
Yes. Dishana, let me start by looking at the global risk report. So when we look at the World Economic Forum, they refer to each year, they get together and assess the global risks. And believe it or not, the first 3 risks that have been identified for 2024 by the World Economic Forum are all to do with the climate emergency. In fact, risk number 1 is extreme weather incidents. And the second and third risks are all to do with the climate emergency. So global leaders are in unison when they say that the world's number 1 risk is the climate emergency and extreme weather incidents as a result of the heating of the planet. Now, a very famous Swedish scientist called Johan Rockström conceptualized this idea of the 9 planetary boundaries. And in all his work in the last 5 to 10 years, he has been basically warning world leaders and national leaders and business leaders that we are slowly but surely crossing these nine planetary boundaries, after which time the impacts of the climate emergency become irreversible. And that is the key word, the word irreversibility of actions. So, in his most recent presentation on the subject, he basically said that we have, out of the 9, crossed 7 planetary boundaries, and that is the most recent update. And planetary boundaries are basically, the way he has explained them, are boundaries when we cross them, they become irreversible. So, if we keep on pumping more and more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, there comes a point when we have basically come to a stage where the impacts of a world full of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases will slowly move forward into extreme weather incidents, and we will not be able to reverse that. Similarly with ocean acidification. And similarly, if we keep crossing the boundaries of biodiversity destruction. So basically, what he is telling us is that the world is at a very critical stage, Dishana, in terms of these 9 planetary boundaries. And with every passing day, we are becoming more and more vulnerable to the impacts of crossing them as opposed to mitigating them. And I think it will be fair to say now that having crossed 7 of the 9 planetary boundaries, we are now at a stage where stopping the planet going beyond plus 1.5 degrees centigrade is now near impossible. And now the world has to move towards at least stopping the planet moving towards 2 degrees centigrade and 2.5 degrees centigrade as the main prioritization in terms of action. So, planetary boundaries by Johan Rockström is one of those measures that tell us how important it is for world leaders and business leaders to understand the science behind the climate emergency.
I do see these challenges, but I also do see opportunities um, for us to get into much better state. But unfortunately, a lot of people see this is as a misled, and this is a complaint. But I see opportunity. Um, I see what you articulated this with few facts in line. 75% of the global rainforest is being destroyed as we speak,
Correct.
and also 60% of Earth's species have already been we have lost it. So these are already has taken in multiple folders. So that's quite alarming. And doctor, I wanted to ask the next question from you. What is the national and business leaders do regarding these matters?
Exactly. So I'm a total optimist like you, Deshana, and I believe that businesses and nations now need to combine the value of understanding the sustainability issues with AI and combine them to come up with solutions. So to answer your question, so what must national and business leaders do? The starting point for any one of these two groups is to establish what we call the carbon footprint of the nation or the carbon footprint of the business. Because if we are to reduce carbon footprints, if we are to reduce emissions, our starting point is first establishing what is the carbon footprint of the company. So, in terms of national leaders, let me start with national leaders. If they are science led, they would then commission what we call carbon footprint analysis in terms of establishing the carbon footprint of the nation. And by now, very advanced the scientific data is already available for every nation on the planet in terms of its carbon footprint. So, what is the meaning of the word carbon footprint? The carbon footprint is basically a totality of the use of fossil fuels in terms of that nation's activities and in terms of its energy delivery, etc., etc. Now, what is the measurement? We look at scope 1 emissions, scope 2 emissions, and scope 3 emissions, which is basically looking at where are these emissions and consumption of fossil fuels happening in the country. In terms of a company establishing its carbon footprint, it is similarly measuring the amount of fossil fuels that the company is directly or indirectly using in generating the company's activities. So, the first thing companies must do is to establish their carbon footprint in the case of a nation, or establish the carbon footprint in the case of a company. Once they do that, then what will happen is they will be clearly advised as when they do the carbon footprinting where the concentration of activity is that they need to directly attack to reduce this. So let me give a simple example which is common to both a nation and a business. In terms of its energy consumption, most countries, the energy consumption is basically fossil fuel led. So if we take a lot of the nations in the world, especially in the south, the southern hemisphere, we find that 70% of its energy is coming through the use of fossil fuels like coal and natural gas, which are high in carbon emissions and greenhouse gases. In fact, 70% of the greenhouse gases that are being emitted that cause the climate emergency are carbon dioxide as a result of burning fossil fuels. So, if that is where the issue is, then you have to move from fossil fuels, which are non-renewable sources of energy, to renewable energy sources like hydroelectricity, like solar power, like wind power. And that is a simple example of how what a national leader or a business leader should do in terms of reducing its carbon footprint. And deployment of green technologies is now very advanced. And the good news for all of us is the cost of solar panels and batteries and wind power has reduced over 80% in the last 10 to 15 years. So today, as one looks at the options, it has come to a stage where it is economically more feasible to move into renewable energy sources than move back into fossil fuels like importation of coal and burning of coal and natural gas. So we are now at an inflection point where the decision to move to renewables is now an economic decision. It is economically more feasible for nations and countries and businesses to move into renewables. So this is now the situation we are faced with, Dikshan. So now we need business leaders and national leaders who look at the whole issue and say, I have a scientific reason to make the change, and now I have an economic reason to make the change as well to move into renewable energy sources.
Fantastic, Doctor. It is true because if you really don't analyze your facts, you won't be able to compute the problem that you have in hand. So, in order to fix something, you need to first measure your current state. Now, if I add something to that, you spoke a lot about science base. Now, science is always driven by data. So, when you really look at a nations to move forward, or even to an organization to move forward for a much more sustainable and profitable business or a country, first you need to have a very strong data foundation. And that data will give you information and knowledge in order for you to take the right measurements. And that will give you the stage in terms of how are you going to compare with your current processes, energy consumption, your operations, and to see when you bring these new technologies, AI, and also renewable sources into example, like what you said, solar, it's a clear direction to see whether your PNL is going to be at a better state. That's why I've been always rounding up this conversation that sustainability for some people become a pain point because it's something they need to do in order to report. But I see a huge economic value they can drive into.
Absolutely.
And also there is so much of encouragement by governments, by certain financial institutions, deploying low interest capital and grants for organizations to transform. It's just a matter of bringing the right mindset, understanding the opportunities around it, and also for you to grow. Sustainability it is our environment is changing. Things are becoming difficult as we go. It's going to be tougher and tougher. It's going to be warmer. You will have adverse weather conditions, but it's fixable if you really bring the right mindset. I think due to the time factors, I think I'm going to talk about this a little bit. You can contribute to this, Doctor, in terms of it needs to start from household. Everybody from your home itself needs to bring that ground up thinking that whatever that you consume it with responsibility, because the food wastage is alone globally is 40%. I think we spoke about this in our last. So if you can really cut down that itself, there's an immediate impact in terms of existing businesses without doing anything dramatic. Just try to look at your processes and see how can I improve 1%, 2%, 0.5% in every touch point and reduce that energy consumption. Eventually, end of the year, you will have 37 times improvement into your entire processes. That will add up. So all those things will become a snowball effect. When it starts from the house, it goes into the organization, and the organizations becomes your national figure. So it's just achievable. It's just everybody needs to line up. Obviously, we will have some state won't believe it, but I believe large group of people will start to believe it because it has a significant improvement in your economic value, and that's something that people will never ignore regardless of that. That's one of the things that I have seen, the resistance that people sometimes, especially if you look at an emerging market where some of the poverty levels are very high, if you try to introduce them sustainability and try to become sustainable, it will never fly well because they want to first fix the economic conditions better in order to think about it. So, but if you really start with that mindset, your economic conditions are going to become much better because you're doing much more less frictional activities. Therefore, you make better margins, better profitability, and also your business will create new opportunities. So, having said that, Doctor, thank you very much for sharing your knowledge, and I'm really looking forward for our third episode, which we're going to talk about in terms of what is that board level leadership models that you need to bring into making sustainability initiations. I like to tap your brain on that once again. And thank you very much, Doctor, for participating on this conversation and sharing your knowledge. As always, we really appreciate it and looking forward for the next episode. Thank you very much, Doctor.
Thank you.